Hey, hope you're well. Of course, we'd all like to have one affordable paint sprayer for paints and finishes that would do absolutely everything. A bit of decorating at home, putting some stain on the garden fence, a little bit of paint work for your DIY cabinetry too. But just like having one router that does it all, there's always going to be some compromise along the way. So in this video, I'm going to go through the pros and cons of 3 different sprayer types, what you might want to use each of them for. Now, I've done a fair bit of spraying. There's a whole playlist with previous videos on it. I'll link it up down below. And as my 10-minute workshop plus members know, I've been spraying the walls and ceiling in the new workshop recently. I'll let you know which spraying system I went for, which sprayers I bought a little bit later on. I'm talking about the more budget-friendly entry-level sprayers here, so I'm not going to be getting into the more trade-rated or industrial types like air-assisted airless or electrostatic spraying, nothing like that. But I will be taking a look at adding a spray gun to your compressor. I'll be taking a look at using a dedicated high volume, low pressure or HVLP system, and also using an airless system too. Again, all entry-level budget gear, and I'll take you through the pros and cons of each type so that you know the best place to put your hard-earned cash. And if that turns out to be just some more brushes and rollers, then so be it. I'm not trying to sell you on anything. Before we get into the details, there's a few home truths about spraying that you might want to consider. Spraying is messy, it just is. You can minimize the mess, but you're turning a liquid paint or stain or lacquer into a cloud, and you're pointing that cloud at whatever it is you're trying to paint. Most of it will hit the mark, but some of it will always miss, and that overspray can cause you a bit of a headache. Now, every manufacturer of every different system will tell you that theirs produces less overspray than the others. And whilst I'm sure that they can back up those claims, in my experience, and I've used all 3 systems I'll be talking about today, in my experience, the only way to minimize overspray is with a dedicated spray booth with a honking great extractor fan behind a wall of spray booth filters. That works really well for cabinet doors and shelves. Obviously, not so useful for your garden shed. And let's be honest, that kind of setup is probably beyond the means of most folks here. Now, one way to deal with overspray is masking off the areas to be kept clear, though of course that adds to the prep time. And the other thing to think about is cleanup time as well. Whichever spray system you go for, the cleanup will take longer than pouring the unused paint back into the can and binning the tray liner. And don't forget that when you want to change finishes, not necessarily a different color, but like changing from a primer or undercoat to a top coat in gloss or eggshell, for example, what it is that we need to do to move from one to the other, again, it's always going to be more involved than pulling a fresh brush and roller from the pack and swapping the paint trays over. Let's start with the compressor option. If you've already got the compressor, or if you're thinking about buying one, then adding a spray gun into the mix to get that silky smooth finish has a lot of appeal. My YouTube pal Keith Brown did a great video about this exact topic. I'll link his video down below, and while it might seem like a relatively cheap option to just add a spray gun, it's not necessarily as straightforward or as cheap as you might think. So air-powered sprayers all broadly work the same way, where the paint is added to a stream of air that atomizes the liquid into a spray that you can direct at your workpiece. You can use HVLP spray guns with a compressor, but you'll typically need something like a 200-litre compressor to get the amount of air you need. Otherwise, you'll have to stop spraying and wait for the compressor to catch up. I did a spraying course last year at the Park Royal Open Workshop. Shout out to the 2 Alexes there, and also to Owen from Symphony Coatings, who ran that course. And Park Royal Open Workshops have a thoroughly intimidating 7,500 watt 500-litre compressor that runs at 10 bar. That spray booth is also available for hire, by the way, and I'll put links in the description. Most folks, though, use a low volume, low pressure or LVLP spray gun, as these will work with compressors of around 50 litres, though hybrid guns are also available too. And if that's the direction you want to go in, then it's probably worth having a chat with somebody with a bit more specialist knowledge before you chunk down all your hard-earned cash. You don't want the spraying pressure to drop as the compressor tank empties, so you'll need a regulator somewhere on the airline as well, and a water trap or filter too. These compressor compatible spray guns have a lot of settings, many moving parts, and you can change the needle, control the flow, the amount of spray that comes out, the fan shape and size. This is great if you know what you're doing, but it could be a bit more challenging if you're new to spraying, as there are many things that can affect the finish, and the paint needs to be thinned, as these systems don't work well with thicker finishes like emulsion paints that you use for decorating. The spray guns tend to be gravity fed too, where the paint cup sits on top of the gun. Obviously, this will work well if you're spraying on the flat, or vertically, not so well if you need to spray overhead, for example. So the pros and cons of adding a spray gun to your compressor: on the positive side, it can be a cheap place to start and simple too. It can be quiet as well. The compressor only runs when it needs to, and it doesn't have to be in the same room if you've got a long enough air hose. The fittings on the air hoses and guns are pretty much universal. Your brand of compressor won't tie you to a specific gun, for example, and there are plenty of cheaper spray guns available, whether that's a middle aisle or Amazon special. The paint is contained just in the cup and the gun, so it's relatively easy to clean up to and to change colors and finishes. On the downside, as I said, you need a pretty big compressor, which is relatively expensive if you're starting from scratch, and even a 50-litre compressor is just too big physically for the space that many people have. It's not a portable solution. You're restricted by the length of the hose and the cable, and you'll be carrying the paint you're using in the gun, so there's some additional weight there. Plus, you'll probably need to top that up frequently if you're spraying a larger area, as most paint cups don't hold much more than a half a litre or so. Let's look at dedicated high volume, low pressure, or HVLP sprayers next. At the budget end, these typically have a separate mains powered electric blower unit, a turbine that creates the airflow, and the paint, gun and cup are connected to it by a hose. The turbine produces a lot of air but without much oomph. High volume, low pressure. I've had a couple of these, an Airless one from way back and a bargain basement little Amazon machine that I featured in the videos on the playlist. And there's a £60 Erbauer that's available, and many others too. It's worth bearing in mind that the turbine runs constantly like a little vacuum cleaner in reverse, so air flows through the gun constantly, but it only picks up paint when you pull the trigger. That's not a big deal, but if you've masked off areas with the thin polythene dust covers, then the airflow through the gun can make them flap about onto freshly painted surfaces. Don't ask me how I know that. There's usually a small degree of control on the gun. You can change the orientation of the spray fan from upright to horizontal and a round pattern too if you adjust the nozzle at an angle. So not a huge amount. There's often a flow control dial on the gun as well, but I've got to say, on the ones that I've tried, they've never made a great deal of difference. Let me know in the comments if you've had better success with them than me. The paint cup is typically underneath the gun, and it uses a tube in the cup to suck it out. So on the positive side, they can be a cheap way to get started in spraying, and the lack of adjustment means they're pretty simple to use. They're quite lightweight, so portable to an extent, and the paint is contained in the cup and gun, so they're straightforward to clean out for color or finish changes. Some of the cheaper guns also come with 2 cups as well, which makes it even easier to make those changeovers. On the negative side, you'll be shocked to learn that the cheaper turbines have shorter cables, and because the gun is tethered to the turbine by a relatively short hose, it means that you need to carry the turbine with you or park it somewhere handy, which could be a bit of an issue if you're up a ladder. Single-stage turbines like the ones you get on entry-level sprayers will struggle with thicker paints like emulsion paints, so they're probably best suited for smaller projects, cabinets, trim and mouldings, rather than decorating complete rooms. There doesn't seem to be any standards for fittings, certainly at the cheaper end of the market, so while it's a fairly simple plastic hose between the turbine and the gun that's probably easy to adapt, things like the paint cup won't usually be interchangeable between brands. By the way, you can get all-in-one HVLP sprayers where the turbine is part of the gun. I've seen a cheap Parkside one in the middle aisle, and a more expensive Wagner one too. The main drawback with those is the weight, because you're carrying everything around with you, the turbine, the paint, everything. And of course, it's physically quite a big unit, so it'll be harder to fit into smaller spaces. You can get cordless all-in-ones as well. My YouTube pal Stuart, a proper DIY, looked at a cheap cordless one for doing his garden fence recently and came much to the same conclusion about the weight and the battery life. I'll link Stuart's video up in the description as well. And finally, let's have a look at airless sprayers. Airless sprayers used to be the preserve of higher end brands, but they're becoming much more affordable, and these are just as they sound. There's no air involved. They're basically a pump that works at very high pressure to force the paint through a tiny hole in the tip of the gun. The tips are interchangeable and each tip produces a specific fan size and flow rate. I've used Airless before. I had the Graco cordless Airless that I bought for a specific job, and I think that Airless is as close to the holy grail of one sprayer that does everything that we're likely to find. I used that for decorating, I used it for cabinetry. I'm sure it would have sprayed a garden fence and a shed just fine as well. But there are many different types of airless sprayers available, mains powered and cordless, ones with a separate paint pot, ones that can take the paint direct from the tub, and ones that have a paint hopper built into them that you top up. The hose and gun fittings seem pretty standard between the different brands, but the tips aren't always interchangeable. In particular, Graco seems to have gone their own way with the tips, but the guard that the tip fits into, they are interchangeable between the different spray guns. Other than changing the tip and the pressure on the pump, there's no adjustment besides changing the fan from portrait to landscape or turning the tip backwards if you need to clear a blockage. I have bought the Airless airless sprayer. I'll be going into a bit more detail on this in a separate video before too long, where I'll be getting into the nuances of tip size, finish to be applied, and the job to be done. But it's performed very well so far, so keep your eyes peeled for that video coming along soon. On the positive side, you get a great finish. You can spray thicker paints like emulsions of walls and ceilings, general decorating are no problem. And you can spray a thinner finish onto cabinetry too, with nothing but a change of tips. I paid £200 just over for the Airless, so something like that is within the price range of a lot of people. And it comes with a standard hose and gun fittings, but just remember that they are high pressure hoses, so they're not the quick release type that you get with a compressor. The spray guns for an Airless sprayer are lightweight. The paint comes direct from the pump, so it doesn't matter which way up the gun is, you can spray upside down if you need to. And on the guns that don't have a paint cup attached, the gun is so much smaller, it can get into tighter spots, for example, right inside the corners of a cabinet. On the flip side, something like the Airless that draws the paint direct from the tub isn't particularly portable. And while the 9 meters of high pressure hose gives you great reach, it's also full of paint. So that's 9 meters of paint to flush through every time you change from primer to top coat or to a clear lacquer. I haven't actually measured it, but I'm told it's about 1/4 of a litre lost with every change. That's not a big deal if you're using a bargain basement tub or contract emulsion, but much harder to swallow with a more costly pot of paint. Air sprayers can be noisy too, although they're not running constantly like the turbine. You can move them further away by using a longer hose, of course, but then a longer hose means more to flush through later on. Now, some will say that the finish you get from an Airless sprayer isn't as good as the one you can get from an HVLP unit or compressor-fed LVLP, and maybe they're right, but I'm not working to those kind of grand piano high-gloss standards, and I don't expect sprayers at this kind of price point to deliver that either. If that's what you need, then you may want to up your budget a little from the entry level. Anyway, that's my quick overview of the 3 main sprayer types that are kind of within reach for most of us consumers, us non-professionals. I'll wrap this one up for now. Thanks so much for taking a look. If you've got any questions, leave them down below. Next up will be the alcove units or workshop update, not sure which yet. And then I'll have a chat about the Airless sprayer and maybe the other Airless sprayer that I've picked up that might just be the keeper. As always, leave a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.